Hi, this is Mary, Dr. Mary Schoenfeldt, and I'm going to respond to a question that I got from one of my students in the Pierce Homeland Security Emergency Management Program. And it's a question coming from a student in my volunteer management course. But it's also a question that I think is pertinent to one of my other courses that I'm teaching this quarter, which is on children and disasters. And I think it may have some value with any of our students and maybe with any emergency managers. So let me say thank you, first of all, to John, who asked the question. And he emailed me with a question that says, given all the assignments with finding and learning about resources available for children, what do you think would be the best for the kids who survived the shooting at Robb Elementary in Texas? Um, and I answered him quickly, but I said, let me talk about it in this way. And let me just start by saying, and I think that some of you know either through my introduction as a professor or through my bio, that I am an emergency manager with a specialty in school and community crisis. And what that means, that specialty, it just means that I've been to a lot of these. And I've worked with a lot of schools, I've worked with a lot of communities, and I've worked with a lot of families and with emergency responders as we were responding to incidences of mass violence. So, everything from my own experience with responding into Littleton, Colorado, all those years ago with the Columbine shooting, and then a number of other activities along the way, helping schools write their crisis response plans and their recovery plans, responding into a number of different school incidences and community incidences of mass violence as well. I was asked to join a specialty team and traveled to Sandy Hook, Connecticut, following that incredibly horrendous school shooting. And then I stayed beyond my initial request to provide some emotional support to find out what this does, this kind of an event. What does it do to a community, to the fabric of a community, and what does it have to do with emergency management? And lots of interesting things there for sure. And some of that I'll share. And I also was director of recovery for the Marysville School District following the mass murder suicide that happened in the cafeteria there. So, and I guess all of that just says that I've learned some lessons from others, and I've seen some things and thought some things, and that's what I want to share with you. So, his first question is, given all the assignments about finding and learning about resources, what do you think would be the best for kids who survived this shooting? So, I'm going to talk about it from short term and from long term, because certainly there are some short term things that um, need to be in place, and I think are in place, and then there are some long term as well, that because this won't be over in the next few days or few weeks or few months for these children. So let me start by talking about the short term. And I think one of the most critical things for these children in the short term is to be able to have specialized mental health available to them that can listen to them talk about what their real true experience was, and that specialized mental health is able to hear as a third grader talks about climbing out a window, or a third grader talks about laying next to a classmate that may be deceased, or a third grader or fourth grader talks about the fright of a locked door and the noises and the sounds that they were hearing. They need to be able to talk about that in age appropriate language, and they need people who can hear that. They need adults that are specially trained to hear that, because that's not the kind of thing that the majority of us are going to be able to hear without cringing. And these kids need to have the adults that can listen to that, so that the kids don't think that they need to protect the adults by not telling them what their real thoughts and feelings are. So from that short term, absolutely, kids need that place. Kids also need their parents to have the same place. Maybe not the same place, but a similar place. Because parents need that place also, so that they can talk about just how terrified they were of being afraid that one of their children was the victim. So, and parents need their own place so that they're not talking about that to their children. And parents need their own place in order to cry or to scream or to, beat on pillows or whatever it is that they need to do. That's an action, obviously, for parents, but it's an action that will help to support these kids. The other group that needs the same kind of specialized mental health, who can listen to what it is that somebody is saying, is the other group are school teachers and school staff. Because I know that school staff are going to show up, and because they know that kids need those hugs, and they need to know that school staff is there for them. But the school staff also needs their own place. One of the other things that these kids are going to need in order just to help them survive is they're going to need a place to take a break. They don't need to be immersed in this emotion 24 hours a day. Neither do the adults. But kids need to know that it's okay to laugh and to play. Kids need to know that you don't have to stay in that emotional place 24 hours a day. So they need a break physically. They need a break emotionally, and so they need a place to get that break. Now, I know that there are some specially trained crisis response dogs that have been asked and have deployed into that community in Texas. Kids need places that they can just snuggle in with a dog or with something that's comforting to them, where they don't have to talk. They don't have to do anything other than just be a kid. And that's going to be critical for these kids. They also need educational support. Now, I know with this particular incident, it's right at the end of the school year. And I hope that the community is doing what they can do to gather kids in groups, even though it is the end of the school year. But these kids are going to need certainly some specialized educational support over the next few months, the next year, the next several years, because trauma changes the neurological paths in the brain. And what these kids encountered, whether they were close to the scene or whether they were in a classroom a long ways away and heard the shooting, or had to go out a window, whatever their experience was, what we know is that the neurological paths in the brain most likely will be changed as a result of that experience. And what that means is that their ability to learn and to think, and maybe even to talk and to come up with language, may be impacted. Now, we also know that brains are plastic and they're pliable, and over a period of time, with some mitigation actions, those neurological paths will sort themselves out in some form or another. But these kids are going to have a challenge learning in the same way that they'll not go back to the same way that they learned as they did prior to this event. So their memory, their ability to problem solve, their ability to concentrate, their ability to physically sit still will be changed. So they're going to need some very specialized educational support along the way. So those are some of the things, and I know that the absolute best resources are on their way and are in Texas. Unfortunately, we've had enough of these that we've learned from them, and that we now know a little better about how to support and how to move people forward. Doesn't mean we're perfect and we don't have a whole lot left to learn. But probably the most important thing, if I can leave just a couple of underscore a couple things: specialized mental health, where kids can truly listen, and they can hear and they can talk about what their experience was with an adult that can listen to that and can hear that. That's critical. And the other thing I would say, just to underscore, is they need a place to take a break. They need a place where they can just be a kid. The other thing, both short term and long term, is these kids need not to be the center of attention and for this to be their entire identity. And when I say that, what I mean is they need to be protected from being asked a lot of questions, whether that's from the media, whether that's from loving, well-intentioned aunts, uncles, cousins, grandmas, grandpas, neighbors, where people are even just simply saying, "How are you doing?" Even that needs to be controlled a little bit, because these children now will become potentially the center of attention and will be asked over and over and over again, "Gee, what was that like?" Or "How are you doing?" Or any number of questions. So these kids need to be given permission to say, I know you care about me, but I'm not going to answer that question today. Maybe tomorrow, but right now I'm not." So some specialized skills, and certainly that support to 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 give that child permission to say, "No, I'm not going to talk about it." But maybe some skills around boundaries, or some skills about how to talk about it, how to talk about this much of it, but not talk about this much if you're not quite ready to be that yet. So those are some of the things that I thinking about resources. And the next question that John asked is, do you think that help will be adequate? Well, that's just an interesting question, because I don't know what adequate is. And I don't know what's adequate, and I don't know what that means. I do know that the absolute best of everything is going there. No question about that. Will it be adequate? For some, maybe yes. For others, maybe not. What we know from other survivors of mass violence, and particularly children, is that they'll process this at their own developmental level, whatever that is, conceptually and language wise, and all of the rest of it, and that they will need specialized mental health to be available for them all of the rest of their lives. I know just this past week that there have been adults that were children in schools when there was something similar, and they're survivors of that, that now this week, years later, those adults are now being triggered back into their experience of 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. So the long-term mental health availability is critical. And by the way, there very well could be some of that, because we've got a system and that will allow people to have access to long-term mental health. So what we may see, as we may see with some of these children, that it just seems that, they're coping, and life's not wonderful, and they're not who and what they were prior to that incident, but they're coping pretty well. And it gets to be time for these kids to go to middle school, and there's a transition. What we may find is that that's when a mental health piece pops up, or when these young children start into puberty and start developing from a youth perspective, a teenage perspective. There could be some things that crop up. Or maybe when they're grown up and they're adults and now they've got children of their own, and they've been coping quite well up until now, and now they're getting ready to send their own child off to school as a kindergartner, and they go, "Whoa, wait, no, I've got too many things here." So that long term mental health is going to help. But the question about adequate, that has to do with individuals. It has to do with a lot of other things. And again, I'm just not quite sure what that word adequate means, and how anybody would define that. But it's an excellent, excellent question. And then the last question that John asked was, how would he, as a potential volunteer program manager or an emergency manager, be involved? And that's the crux of the question. That's what we need to learn from. And there's a lot of lessons in school violence or in community violence, whether it's something that happens at a fairground or at a concert or in a grocery store or in a workplace. There are a lot of roles that we as emergency managers need to be thinking about and need to be planning for, because we have a critical role in recovery and in early response, and how we organize early response impacts recovery. So let me start by just addressing that potential volunteer program manager question. If you were a volunteer program manager, how might you be involved in something like this? Well, I'll give you a couple of very specific examples. If you were a program manager for a CERT program, Community Emergency Response Team, I'll tell you that in Marysville, in the shooting, that the cafeteria incident that I was director of recovery for, I pulled from neighboring jurisdictions CERT programs and had those volunteers do things like just have a volunteer vest on, so they looked official. It helped with a sense of safety. And they stood at doors. And when we did community meetings, they handed out just some handouts to parents as they were coming in. They were perceived as being helpful and as being a little bit extra security in some ways. And so that increased that sense of safety for that community. Also they came on campus several times, and they help to clean up, or kind of organize a disorganized remembrance fence, where people had been leaving teddy bears and flowers and all kinds of other things. So they helped with that. They also, helped with, we brought in, coffee and donuts a couple of different times, and they helped serve that. And here's one of the keys. They were a volunteer group that had been vetted and background checked. And that's critical in something like this, that the volunteers who are coming are known, because there's an awful lot of spontaneous, unaffiliated volunteers that want to help. And then there's this thing called a trauma tourist that, for whatever reason, they just want to be there and kind of see what's happening with the energy. So what we need is we need volunteers that can do any number of things that are credible and that are vetted and background checked. So they're through some kind of a volunteer organization. We also used amateur radio operators, and they helped with parking at various events, not just at school, but other things that were happening in the community. Other ways that volunteer managers might be involved is if you are a volunteer manager for a program through the United Way, for instance, and you have some members of your volunteer group that maybe is a graphic artist. Well, that could be a need that could be used, or might be identified in some way that could be helpful. Or maybe you have a volunteer, if you're the United Way volunteer program coordinator, maybe you have a volunteer that's a banker. And so, with some of those financial donations pieces and just kind of managing some of that, maybe you are a volunteer coordinator or liaison with the local Rotary Club, with a service club, and you've got some specialized requests of some sort that members of a service club might be able to help you with, whether that was organizing some food or whether that was helping to find an empty building, because we've got all of these agencies that are coming into town and they need office space. Well, your local Rotary Club may very well have a commercial property realtor or a property management firm that would be able to help. So those are some ways that volunteer coordinators might be involved when I just think about it off the top of my head. Um, Obviously, if you're a volunteer coordinator and you're looking for specialized mental health, then you would be very, very useful. Volunteer coordinator, if you've got 6 of those crisis response dog programs that are coming into your community, and I'll tell you from experience, there's also therapy pigs that may come, therapy rats. I mean, there's any number of things, and those are different stories that I'll tell at another time. But somebody needs to coordinate all of that. And so that would be, as a volunteer coordinator, as a volunteer manager, you may take on that so that we know where people are and we know who's vetted, who's approved, and who's providing what services, so we don't overserve by having 3 different organizations go to one location and nobody goes to another one. So, and then, the other half of John's question was about how would I, as a potential emergency manager, be involved. Um, and I will tell you, I've been doing a lot of training and talking about that just this week, because emergency management has a huge role. This response will be over with. Law enforcement, medics, the school in some ways, other responders, hospitals, funeral homes, those responders will be done in a day, 2 days, 3 days. But the need in that community doesn't go away. And just because this was something that happened on a school doesn't make it the school's responsibility, right? It does not make it the school's responsibility to do everything, to provide everything that needs to be done. It is a community responsibility. So the responders are looking minute by minute. What do I do next? What do I do next? What do I do next? Emergency managers, part of our professional responsibility, our mission, is to look out and to say, oh, this is going to be needed. Oh, that's going to be needed. And what do we do best? We coordinate resources, right? We coordinate and we think ahead. So our role is going to be donations management as 60,000 teddy bears show up in our community when nobody asks for a single teddy bear. We know how to manage donations, and that's stuff donations, and that might be financial donations as well. We also know how to manage volunteers. That's part of our stock and trade. We also know how to order up resources. So, does this community need extra tents so that they can have a canopy over where they're going to do a candlelight vigil? We know how to do that. We also know the purchasing department and the paperwork that needs to go in and that needs to be in place in order to make all of those things happen. We also know about debris management. And you get a community event like we have seen certainly with this latest school shooting, and that we see in a lot of other things, there's a lot of debris that gets created. We know we have a debris management plan. We know who some of those vendors and some of those haulers are. We know who rents the porta potties. And that's an important piece of information if we're going to do large event management, which is another thing that we know about. And we're going to get an extra 20,000 people in our town, or the president's going to come visit. Those are things that fall on our desks. And I think one of the other most important things that we do is we look forward. We know that this is going to take a while, but we also know that there will be an end, that somehow we will transition back to something that somehow might have looked typical or familiar. But the police don't plan for that. That's not their job. Their job is an immediate response. Fire and medics don't plan for that. School district maybe a little bit, but they also have no clue what's in front of them. Hospitals, well, they know what they need to do to treat, and then they release, right? But we think forward. That's why we have a planning and intelligence. That's why we do the things that we do. So, right from the very beginning, how we organize makes a difference long term. So, as an emergency manager and that emergency management department, we are thinking a day out, 2 days out, a week out. Of a week from now, we're going to need to be doing XYZ, and now we need to line up those resources. So when it gets to be a week out and X or Y or Z is happening, we're ready for that. And we also know that recovery is going to take a very long time, but at some point we need to transition. We're not going to stay in this event forever. And then the last point that I definitely want to make is about policies and partnerships. That's our role. We can guide policies within our jurisdiction, whether that's a city, whether that's a county, whether that's a state, whatever that is. And we need to have policies in place ahead of time about things like memorials, because memorials will all of a sudden just grassroots, they will grow up and they will become a real challenge. And then we need to think about, when is that memorial going to be taken down from in front of that flagpole or moved out of that street? Well, policies ahead of time. And this is a place for us to guide our city leaders, that says memorials of the grassroots kind can stay up for a designated period of time, maybe a month. And I've seen some policies that have taken that little piece of advice, I guess, and they've created some policies about that. So that's a critical piece for us. And the other one is partnerships. That we have partnerships, and we are continually developing those public-private partnerships. So we know people, right? We have that network of networks. We hopefully know our entire community, that whole community that we work so hard in order to have relationships with. So those are some of the things that we do as emergency management. There's a longer list, but that at least scratches the surface. And I just want to end with another comment or two, and that is thank you for being a part of this profession. Thank you for those of you who are Pierce College Homeland Security Emergency Management students. And you are the bright spot. You are the future. And you're involved with a program that's a great program. And then on a personal level, I just also want to encourage all of us to keep learning, but also to keep noticing. And when I say noticing, what I mean is pay attention to those folks around you. The Secret Service, the FBI, the statistics tell us that very few of these perpetrators did this act without anyone else knowing about it. The majority of these, somebody knew, somebody had heard about it, somebody saw a social media post or overheard a conversation, and for whatever reason they didn't take it seriously, or they thought, gee, not my business, not I don't know what to do with this, so I'll let somebody else take care of it. If there is something that is of concern, raises the hair on the back of your neck, it just gets your attention, please share that with law enforcement, with somebody, and hope that you're wrong. Absolutely hope you're wrong, but just in case you're not, because statistically, what we know is that the majority of these, somebody knew. We will never prevent them all. I wish we could. I wish my magic wand worked. It doesn't. But we can prevent many. And in fact, through the Department of Justice and some other partnerships, there is a group that has started to gather information on those that have been prevented. And you can Google averted school violence and find one of the latest reports. And it's pretty fascinating as it talks about some of the very simple steps that were taken that stopped one of these from happening. Again, we're never going to prevent them all, but we can prevent some. But it takes us saying, gee, that makes me a little uncomfortable, so I'm just going to share that information. So thank you, John, for asking the question and the three questions. I appreciate the opportunity to share just with some of my thoughts, some of the lessons that I've learned along the way from people who've learned very, very hard lessons personally. So reach out if you have some comments, if you have any questions, anything that I might be able to answer for you, or any resources that I might be able to give you, or any help I might be able to give you. Please do that. My personal email is yoursafeplace@msn.com. So again, thank you, John, for asking the question. Thank you all for being interested enough to listen to some of the lessons that I'm able to bring from some other folks. So take care of yourself. Hug your kids a little tighter.